The house on Saratoga Trail looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet, suburban, ordinary. Police lights reflected faintly off the driveway as an officer stood at the front door, knocking again harder this time. Inside, there was no answer, no movement, no sound. That silence was the first warning. Before the investigation even began, before the interrogations, before the headlines, something was already wrong. Not because of what was missing, but because of what was too clean, too controlled, too calm. And standing just a few feet away, watching everything unfold with his arms folded and his voice steady, was Chris Watts. Before prison, before confessions, before the world knew his name, there was something Chris Watts feared more than incarceration. And that fear had already reshaped everything. From the outside, Chris appeared cooperative, almost helpful. He spoke softly, answered questions, explained schedules. He told officers his wife, Shanann Watts, had left with the children after an argument. It sounded rehearsed but not dramatic, not emotional. That, investigators would later say, was the first unusual clue. People in crisis usually show panic, confusion, desperation. Chris showed none of it. His voice never cracked. His breathing never changed. His posture remained closed but controlled, as if he were managing something internal, something fragile. The body language didn't match the story. As neighbors gathered at a distance, one figure stood out, Nicole Atkinson, Shanann's close friend. She was anxious, pressing, insistent. She had arrived earlier than expected and sensed something was wrong almost immediately. Shanann's phone was still inside. Her car was still there. The children's belongings hadn't moved. Chris claimed she'd left anyway. That contradiction lingered in the air, unanswered. When investigators entered the home, they noticed something unsettling. The house wasn't chaotic. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of a struggle. The beds were made. The floors were clean, too clean. In criminal investigations, disorder often tells a story. Here, order did. It suggested intent, control, preparation, and beneath that surface calm was something more disturbing: avoidance. Chris avoided eye contact when discussing his marriage. He deflected when asked about emotional conflict. When questioned about divorce, his tone changed, not louder, not angrier, but tighter. Shorter sentences, less detail. Fear had entered the room. Financial records soon added another layer: mounting debt, missed payments, a lifestyle stretched beyond its limits. But finances alone didn't explain the tension that had been building behind closed doors. Text messages revealed escalating marital strain. Shanann had been vocal about repairing the relationship or ending it if necessary. Divorce wasn't a hypothetical anymore. For Shanann, it represented separation and survival. For Chris, it represented exposure. Investigators began to understand that Chris's fear wasn't rooted in punishment. It wasn't about jail time, public judgment, or legal consequences. It was about loss of control. Divorce meant financial scrutiny, emotional confrontation, a public unraveling of the image he had carefully constructed. It meant being seen fully, honestly, and without the ability to hide behind silence. Psychologists would later describe this as identity collapse. When a person's self-worth is tied to appearing stable, compliant, and in control, divorce becomes more than a breakup. It becomes annihilation, and Chris Watts was terrified of that. The first interview footage only deepened the unease. Chris sat alone, speaking directly to the camera, pleading for his family's return. His words were correct. His tone was calm. His expression barely moved. There were no tears. Viewers sensed it immediately. Something wasn't right. Investigators did too. This wasn't panic, it was performance. As the investigation expanded, another name surfaced quietly at first, then unmistakably: Nicole Kessinger. A coworker, a secret relationship, a future Chris had begun to imagine. In that future, there was no divorce court, no shared custody, no financial collapse, no confrontation, just escape. That realization reframed everything. Chris wasn't running from prison, he was running from divorce. The timeline tightened. Surveillance footage showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning in unusual detail. Neighbors reported movements that didn't align with his story. Each inconsistency added pressure, but Chris didn't break, not yet. Instead, he retreated further inward, clinging to control even as it slipped away. This wasn't impulsive behavior, It was calculated avoidance, the desperate effort of a man trying to preserve a version of himself that was already crumbling. And the more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became, this wasn't about rage, it wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't even about love, it was about fear. A fear so overwhelming that Chris believed anything was preferable to the exposure divorce would bring. As investigators prepared for the next phase, formal interrogations, evidence analysis, and psychological profiling, they understood that they weren't chasing a man who feared consequences. They were dealing with someone who feared being seen for who he really was. And once that fear took hold, there was no limit to how far it could push him. Because when a person is more afraid of losing control than losing freedom, the truth becomes the most dangerous thing of all. And the truth was getting closer.